Every morning, the world wakes to fresh scenes of horror from inside Gaza. Yet, despite international outrage from every level of society, the violence just continues. Over 53,000 Palestinians have been killed, the overwhelming majority women, children, and civilians. To put those numbers into perspective, we are about to eclipse the total number of Palestinians who have been killed since 1948, and nearly the same number of U.S. military that were killed in the entirety of the Vietnam War. 14 weeks ago, which now feels like 14 years ago, we had Bill Van Esveld from Human Rights Watch here with us on Fractured. We discussed the intensity of the challenges to bring aid into the country during a ceasefire, how much has actually been destroyed in terms of the infrastructure, and how difficult it is to provide education for the youth impacted by the war. While we work on new reports of more current realities on the ground inside Gaza, we thought it was important to bring our talk with Bill back to the top of the feed.
Welcome back to Fractured. Today we're going to a topic that divided basically the whole society. We're going to go to Gaza and Western Bank. We're going to discuss situation in Palestine. However, we're not going to do it from a purely political point of view. This everybody follows in every possible news. Our aim is and always was to bring the underreported stories. And one of those stories is the education for children, what is happening to them and how it looks like, how it may look like right now when the ceasefire is on. And to talk to us about this issue is Bill Van Esveld from Human Rights Watch, the Associated Director, MENA and Children Rights Division, right? So you're a perfect person to talk to us about that. Okay, Bill. Is it a naive question if I start by asking if there was any type of education during the attack and the bombardment in Gaza for children there?
So thanks for focusing on this issue. I mean, I think it's really hugely important and underreported. The official answer is zero. There was no formal education, there was no structured education going on since October 7th, 2023, when all of this started in Gaza. There were probably informal education things happening, maybe even within families, or there's always one kid who will teach the other kids the things that they learned, but nothing structured. So that means about 640 to 650,000 children, school-aged children in Gaza, all of them had zero formal education, nothing structured, for the last basically 2 academic years. It's been zero.
So it was suspended by the ministry there.
We have to so there was the attacks by Palestinian armed groups, followed almost immediately on October 7th by massive bombardment from the Israeli side into Gaza, and it was just kind of deadly to send kids out to school, so the schools were canceled. Since then, I think we're at almost or even over 90% of the schools in the Gaza Strip are either destroyed or so damaged that, according to a sort of, this is all very preliminary, like based on satellite imagery, because people still haven't been able to get to even see all the schools that were damaged. But it looks like 90% destroyed or need so much reconstruction that they're offline for the foreseeable future.
But there were the lucky ones that managed to cross to Egypt, right? How did the situation look like there when it comes to education for kids?
Yeah, so sort of between October 2023 and May 2024, the southern border of Gaza with Egypt was still kind of open. And by kind of, I mean you often had to pay a very large amount of money to Egyptian authorities, to a company or to smugglers to get out. And few people could do that, but still about 110,000 roughly were able to get out during that period. In May 2024, the Israeli forces took over that border crossing and completely sealed it. So after May, nobody got out. 110,000 got out. I don't know how many were kids. A guesstimate is half, because sort of roughly half the population of Gaza is children, so maybe half the population who made it to Egypt are also under 18. But there's no sort of official data from the Egyptian side on how many of them were able to go to school. They fall into this gray zone where they're Palestine refugees. So there's this one UN agency, UNRWA, that's supposed to cover them, but they're not really that functional in those parts of northern Egypt's like Sinai Peninsula, which is a kind of a militarized zone where a lot of these kids got stuck. So we don't know how many went to school, but the norm would be that they didn't have a chance to go to public school because you're supposed to, you're required in Egypt to have residency. And they didn't have official residency.
Can they get any residency right now? Or is it a situation of, well, there's a ceasefire, go back?
Yeah, I mean, we're not hearing of people being forced back from Egypt to Gaza, but at the same time, there's no sort of plan that I'm aware of to make their ability to stay in Egypt permanent and legal. So the Egyptian authorities have taken this sort of strange bureaucratic approach of if you were one of the lucky ones who got out of Gaza into Egypt, you got basically a 1-day validity transfer visa. And yet they haven't been cracking down on people. Those are long expired, right? Everybody who's been in Egypt, like they're officially not really supposed to be there, but the authorities aren't taking action. But it's still kind of hanging over everybody's heads. And
if they want it, it's
if they want to get rid of them,
immediate.
I read in some Egyptian media, they talking about the people who are Palestinian Syrians having issues getting their papers. Because now the government in Egypt, the Sisi, the president, he has issues with the new, let's say, president in Syria, because he's afraid it's going to happen the same in Egypt. And he gets kicked out. So he's blocking every Syrian, and including Syrian Palestinians. And even the ones that are inside, they are not getting the full rights. Children,
Surprised me.
In 2018, I worked with an organization here called Baitna. It's a UK organization. They were funding some NGOs here, and we created programs called, it's all under Baitna. Baitna in Arabic means our home. And it was about, teaching, but healing. It's not actually teaching, but healing first with play, games and stuff. And then when the kids, you see they are ready, you go to teaching. Do you think the kids in Gaza now, after the war ended, are ready for a normal schedule? Or they need to be some stuff before being done by psychologists, social workers to prepare them, because it's a burden. I know kids, maybe they will not remember a lot, but it's there. The trauma is in your body, is in your mind. How can they deal with this?
Yeah, wow. It is kind of hard to even wrap one's head around what kids in Gaza have gone through. I mean, it's really, even to describe it, we don't know how many kids lost one or both of their legs or arms, but it's more than 10,000. It could be much more than that. How many kids lost one or both parents? How many kids saw their siblings killed in front of them, were in the house when it was hit by a bomb, were hungry for 15 months, were malnourished, couldn't get medicine. If you get an infected wound, it could be something that would be treated in a day in a hospital with medication, but for you in Gaza, it could be a death sentence. And that a relative dying of a wound like that would be right in front of your face as a kid because the hospitals might not be accessible and they're in your tent. It's hard to put a picture around what these kids have gone through. UNICEF says every single child in Gaza needs mental health support. Every single, 1 million kids, right? Unsurprisingly, and also unsurprisingly, that is completely unavailable so far. So that's just try to back up and set the stage for where would education come in here? School is in war zones something that can help kids get a sense of normality again. For your experience as a child during the war, obviously nobody cares about your survival even, much less your development. And there's no routine. Like the bombing could happen at 1 a.m, 5 a.m, 3 p.m. You're running from one place to another. Everything is chaos. School is like, okay, you wake up in the morning, I know where I'm going. I'm going to school. And why am I going there? Because they care about me. I'm the center as the child. My development, my rights, my comfort, that's the center. It's amazing what school can do, even for, terrible situations. Maybe Gaza is too much to ask. So there's that. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, but in addition, we know a few things about Palestinian kids and how they learn. One of those things is that UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, which was set up in 1948, to care for Palestine refugees, they've been running schools for that basically the whole time, right? And decades of experience running schools. They've done a lot of studies on how to effectively teach these kids. And one of the things they learned by comparison to other refugee situations is that UNRWA teachers are great teachers in part because they themselves are refugees.
Exactly.
And the kids are also refugees. So like you are sharing a knowledge that may not be written down. It may not be like what specifically it is.
Identify with this person, right?
And like the way they're learning and the stuff they've been through and their behaviors and you know what they're going through at home, you know, because it's happened to your family too. They've been very effective teachers. There's still a lot of those teachers around. I mean, UNRWA had 14,000 active staff in Gaza before October 2023. About 7,000 are still active. Like even through the 15 months, they were still acting, doing their humanitarian stuff. Many of them are teachers. So there is that little moment or that little aspect of hope that they are, Palestinians are, you know, the stereotype I think is true. Palestinians value education greatly. Like they're, despite all of everything they've been through since 1948, like the literacy rates, the educational achievement rates are very high. There's a real social premium placed on a good education, becoming a doctor, engineer, that sort of thing. So the desire is there.
It is all, I think, very typical for extremely marginalized communities that education is valued on a very high level. It's not like in the Western world where people are saying, well, yeah, you like college is, you know, overrated, like it's done. You can be a millionaire by posting stuff on TikTok. I remember when we were in Bangladesh and Rohingya refugees, they were saying that the most important thing for them is education because they realized that they were persecuted in Myanmar just because they had no voice. They had no education, therefore they couldn't take higher jobs. Not only because of that, they were basically cut from the access to those jobs, but the lack of education was part of the fact that they couldn't really communicate their rights, their needs to international community. They couldn't advocate for themselves, right? So there is something about the extremely marginalized communities to value education on that level.
And one thing Palestinians will often say is that, you know, I was kicked out of my house, I was kicked out of my village, my property was destroyed, you know, my money was stolen. But there's one thing they can never take away, which is my education. And my education is a future. And like Palestinians are all over the region doing very skilled work, like go to Dubai, you know, go to Qatar. You'll see Palestinians in a lot of pretty high profile positions because they're so well educated and qualified. Egypt as well.
Now with the ceasefire, are there any moves to rebuild the educational system? I'm not even talking about schools and the buildings, the physical buildings, but is there like anything happening already, or are they like, let's see after the ceasefire is over if it's worth it?
So far, I mean, there's going to be small initiatives, but there's no possibility of scaling it up at this moment. You know, we're in the first phase of the ceasefire. It's pretty tenuous. Everybody hopes it continues, but we don't know. But people are still moving around. People are still just getting back to their destroyed homes. You know, so it's very difficult to do it now.
Who would be responsible for rebuilding this system? Would it be more or less like before, or would the structure change somehow? I mean, authorities-wise.
Well, that's another great question because where are we?
Yeah.
Where is the ceasefire? Who's going to be in charge? What's going on? You know, we can say that before October 2023, there were two main providers of education in Gaza. One was UNRWA, this UN agency, and the other was the Ministry of Education. But that was the Gaza Ministry of Education under the Hamas authorities. And they had a sort of, you know, the usual difficult relationship with the Palestinian Authority education ministry in the West Bank. So, but they were still making it work. I mean, the examinations were all students were able to take them and everything.
Yeah. Was it the same? The
more or less,
UNRWA and okay.
Oh, the UNRWA and the
the ministry.
There was, I think,
more or less exam-wise.
There were differences. But you know, the other thing is that UNRWA would often do primary education, and then kids who went on to secondary would go into government-run schools. So there was that. Not always, but in many cases.
Okay, makes sense.
I read this study by the Cambridge University. It was done September 2024, and they mentioned that between October 2023 and July 2024, there have been 411 teachers died and 15,394 injured. So now the challenge is how to tackle this lack of teachers, because they are really needed now to rebuild the confidence in kids and rebuild the education system.
Yeah, I mean, it's been called scholasticide, just sort of a destruction of, yes, not just 90% of the infrastructure, but like the lives of teachers, you know, and the number of kids who were killed or maimed, again, is just sort of unbelievable.
Yeah, that between October 2023 and 2024, 10,000 kids died. And injury also thousands. I cannot even look at the number.
I mean, it's roughly, the thing is that all the death counts are way underestimates, we know, right? Like for a couple reasons. One is just like the only numbers that were recorded are traumatic death injuries, where a weapon blew up and you died. But if you died from starvation or disease, that wasn't getting recorded because there wasn't capacity. But we know, like all of the estimates are that the number of people who died from disease, lack of water, lack of medication, is bigger than the number of people who died from these traumatic wounds. And about a third of the known death cases are children. And about a quarter of the known traumatic injury cases are children. So that's 25,000 children injured that we know of. It's about 14,000 children killed that we know of, but the actual numbers are worse than that. So again, going back to the sort of the education and trauma question, like the kids who survived are going to be bringing that into the classroom if they can.
Oh my God. I read some estimates. They're saying it's going to take 14 years to rebuild Gaza. And I think it's going to be maybe more. So how education is going to continue inside Gaza with no infrastructure?
Yeah, well, great question. You know, Palestinians are going to step up and teach. Where they do that is a huge question mark right now, because not just schools got destroyed. You know, the universities were basically all attacked, and some of them were completely flattened and like deliberately blown up with sort of explosives carefully placed inside them and deliberately blown up. So where are you going to hold these schools? Like the mosques are also, many of them are gone. The private homes, the majority of all private homes are gone. What space is left? I think we're looking at maybe tents. I mean, we're potentially facing a situation of people living in refugee conditions in their own land. You could be living in a refugee tent right on your own property. Somehow, you know, I guess what I'm saying is that they deserve help. Palestinians are going to step up. The education, I think, is very culturally important. The teacher sort of capital is there. Like they're there. They're ready to teach. Who's going to pay them? Who's going to provide them with the books? You know, even who's going to provide them with some kind of structure? You know, and it's Gaza. It's not like warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It's like baking in the summer and very cold and rainy in the winter. So, you know, all of those tents are going to have to be heated, et cetera, et cetera. It's a massive logistical question.
Do you foresee UNRWA being part of this process? They're facing massive criticism, especially from the US, of course, not mentioning Israel, but are they able to continue after the ceasefire? Like, let's say that the peace is in place.
That's a very tricky question as well. I mean, they should be, right? Like they are the humanitarian backbone of Gaza. Even before October 2023, 70% of people in Gaza required humanitarian aid. 70% were refugees from 1948. UNRWA played a huge part in education in Gaza. I think it was, now I'm blanking on the number of students they had there, but you know, more than 100,000 minimum. In dozens and dozens of schools. So if UNRWA gets shut down, who's going to step up and educate those kids? Now, we don't actually know what the Israelis are doing with UNRWA in Gaza. They have really targeted UNRWA in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That's already getting shut down like today. But there's a slight difference. The permits that Israel issued to UNRWA employees in East Jerusalem, West Bank, they all had an expiry date, which is like today. And they didn't get renewed. So
that's easy. That's easy to do.
They'll have to come up with another excuse to shut it down in Gaza because the permits don't have a...
Like, how come?
Like permits for like ID, some kind of
like your sort of work and residency. So the permits for UNRWA staff in Gaza don't have an expiration date. So Israel's going to have to come up with some other way if they want to shut them down.
But like, from like even logistical point of view, if it's not UNRWA, then what? Because like it's not that people will really take care of themselves in this situation. They have been dependent on humanitarian aid since 1948. There's nothing to be the substitute of UNRWA.
Yeah. There's nothing to be the substitute of UNRWA in terms of education and in terms of a whole bunch of other issues that are crucial for kids. I mean, unexploded weapons. Like there was a major confrontation in Gaza, or major bombing in Gaza in 2014, for example. And the estimate was that 10% of all the bombs Israel dropped in 2014 were unexploded. And so UNRWA was crucial to getting the UN mines people in there to demine and clear those contaminated areas. Now that was 2014. What we just saw, and it might start up again after the ceasefire, is 100 times worse than 2014. So, and who's always at the greatest risk of unexploded weapons? It's always kids. Those cluster bombs look like toys. They pick them up. So, UNRWA is crucial for education. It's crucial for keeping kids alive. It's crucial for pregnant women, older people, keeping other people alive.
Humanitarian aid.
And Israel's trying to shut it down. And the United States, even under the Biden administration, Congress said no funding for UNRWA until March 2025. And under the Trump administration, now you've got
no funding for all.
The crazy people in the legislature and the crazy people in the executive branch crazy on this issue. The evidence that UNRWA was in some institutional way responsible for October 7th, 2023 is non-existent. There is no evidence. There is it was, yes, it's bad. There was 10 or so people out of 13 or 14,000 who participated in those attacks. But that was it. They were fired immediately.
Shut down the whole thing.
You shut down. It's collective punishment.
Yeah, exactly. Since you mentioned Western Bank, how did the education look like there during the bombarding? And we know that this was also touched, not by the bombarding, but by different type of attackers, if I can name them like this. How did it look like?
Yeah, so, just again with UNRWA, there were about 45,000 students in UNRWA schools, mainly in refugee camps in the West Bank. So, and that, again, is where Israel's targeted UNRWA to shut it down for real. So we're talking about 45,000 kids who could be out of school. But even before this happens with UNRWA getting shut down, since October 2023, we've documented a lot of opportunistic settler attacks on Palestinian communities, which were unprecedented in two ways. One is that previously settler attacks would often target one or two parts of a Palestinian community, like individuals with sort of outlying houses, that basically covered a lot of land area. The settlers would want that and they'd take that. This time they kicked out entire communities, everybody was forced off their land. And that land has since been fenced in and is taken over by settlers. The Palestinians cannot get back safely. The other unusual thing is that, before it would usually be settlers attack, Israeli soldiers stand there watching, and if Palestinians try to get physical and protect themselves, then the soldiers come in and arrest them or shoot them. That's bad enough, but this time, since October, the soldiers and the settlers are kind of one and the same. A lot of settlers got pulled up into the Israeli military reserves, and they were given weapons, and they were given uniforms, and they were told, do what you need to do. And so it's settlers and soldiers, or the soldiers are settlers, going out there perpetrating these mass expulsions of entire communities.
So,
the point on education is that I researched 5 cases of entire communities getting pushed out. 2 of those communities had schools for their kids, and kids from surrounding areas. Those schools were torched. They're gone. They're completely gone. In addition to that, there would be a huge number of checkpoints and movement restrictions put in place by the Israeli military. So even if you're a kid in a village that's not being attacked and your school's in a village that's not being attacked, maybe you can't get there because there's a checkpoint.
Do you think something will change right now with the ceasefire, or do you think it's a permanent situation, or at least for a longer time?
I think it will get worse.
Yeah.
In the West Bank, it will get worse because the level of violence that we've seen in the West Bank, yes, it was unprecedented in Gaza, and everybody's focus was on Gaza. But what's been happening kind of under the radar in the West Bank was the worst ever recorded during the war. Yeah. And since then, we don't know what the political quid pro quo was between Trump and Netanyahu, but it does look like there's been a green light given to, stepping up the use of, we didn't used to see airstrikes in the West Bank. This is an occupied territory. This is not a war zone. This is an area that the Israeli soldiers have controlled. The level of control is very, very deep. They were handing out traffic tickets to Palestinians. That you had to pay a fine, not just throwing you in a military jail, but the military was giving you traffic tickets. It's that level of control, like where you get your water from depends on the Israelis. It's not a situation where you launch airstrikes as if it's some war zone, but that's now what they're doing. And so the situation for kids in the West Bank, because of UNRWA getting shut down, because of the increasing amount of settler violence and the increasing level of firepower being used by the Israeli forces, it's all bad for kids and education.
How is the situation between for people to move between West Bank and Gaza? Is there any possibility of moving? I was thinking that possibly there are teachers in Gaza, and maybe they could be used in West Bank and could be teaching in Gaza. It could be some kind of exchange and the cooperation between those two.
Well, I mean, I think you're hinting at what the solution has to be, which is to open the borders of Gaza, or open the perimeter of Gaza, which has been sealed very tightly shut since 2007 when Hamas took power, and even more so, since then. The problem with sending teachers from the West Bank in particular to Gaza is there's a history there. The history is that Israel had a policy in place. Basically, if you are Palestinian and you want to move to Gaza, go ahead, but it's a one-way ticket. If you want to get married and one of the partners is from Gaza and one of the partners is from the West Bank, there's no way you can live in the West Bank. The Israeli military will not give you a permit to do that. If you want to go to live in Gaza, go ahead, but you're not coming back.
This has changed, right? Sorry for interrupting, because early 2000s, marrying somebody, for example, for Jerusalem would give you permission to basically live in Jerusalem. You would get this, it was like blue passport, blue document or something like this.
Yeah, that's right. It did change. It used to be not a one-way ticket. It used to be that people could come in. And then the policy changed. And when it changed, actually, there were a bunch of those marriages that never had been formally sort of like the residency of the Gazan partner had never been formally changed by the Israelis to the West Bank. It was still kind of in limbo. And then they got frozen. So there's a whole bunch of couples where like one member is illegally in the West Bank, hoping they don't get found out, because they get deported back to Gaza.
One of the things that are making it worse in the West Bank is the Palestinian Authority there, led by the dictator Mahmoud Abbas. He's a dictator. I mean, he's the president, but he's there for too long. And
he was elected once.
Yeah, who elected him? Yeah, and he thinks that's his, and he's pushing for this more and more violence, and he's kind of the man for Israel inside there. And now they are attacking Jenin, the camp in Jenin, and creating also more chaos, and kids, and everything is in chaos.
Yeah, the level of violence by Palestinian Authority the level of clearly unlawful violence by PA security forces has definitely increased, and yet curiously they're getting more and more weapons.
Yeah, they give them weapons. Funds by Israel. Bill, so I think now is the first mission of education and the first goal to restore hope in kids' hearts. More than educate. This is the first thing. I read a quote, very touchy one, by one of the Palestinian activists. He says, "Children have seen that the international community will sit still as they are killed. This has left them with questions about values that schools and learning aim to instill around the humanitarian principles that teachers will have to navigate." So how are we going to restore hope in their hearts?
Oh, you ask a very difficult question.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's such a burden to place on any teacher in Gaza. And what should the lesson be? They're right. I mean, the person who wrote that quote is right. The world stood by as, thousands after thousands after thousands. Every hour, kids getting killed, and the response was to continue weapons shipments to Israel. What is the response supposed to be to that? And yet education does provide hope, and yet we know so much about the benefits education can bring, right? Like anywhere in the world, World Bank did this massive study, and they found that for every single year you're in school as a child, your earnings as an adult increase by 10%. And that's even higher in some cases, but that's kind of like 10% is the minimum. That's just the most sort of gross materialistic way of looking at it, but like the right to education has also been called the right to have rights, for the reason that was discussed before, that your ability, as the Rohingya refugees were telling you, your ability to stand up for yourself, to know what your rights are, to know what levers of power you can pull to demand your rights. You know, without education, that's even harder for you to get. But I think another thing that we have learned from other conflict situations is that for education to be able to provide hope, there needs to be a meaningful pathway to that better life. You could go from pre-primary to primary to secondary, maybe even to university, but if professions are barred to you, if travel is barred to you, if the economy is in shambles because of a war, like, you know, is there really going to be that much demand for university education or even secondary education amongst kids if all of that stuff is barred to you? And we've seen that with Syrian refugees in different countries. Massive enrollment at primary level, but as they begin to realize that they can't become a doctor, they're not allowed to become a lawyer, they're not allowed to become this or that, demand, you know, decreases for higher education. So we've got to insist that people be allowed to. Well, we've got to, the border regime in Gaza needs to fundamentally change. I forgot to mention this before when we were talking about reconstruction of schools and how long it's going to take. But, you know, back in 2010, there was a shortage of 100 schools in Gaza. 40,000 students had to be turned away by the United Nations who were knocking on the classroom doors and they're like, we have no classrooms for you. Why not?
That's a huge number.
15 years ago.
And that was 15 years ago, right? They had 100 missing schools because the Israeli authorities had imposed this thing where they said concrete and building materials, which you need to build a school, even if, you know, like the UN was saying, we'll track the concrete so we know it goes to the school. And the Israeli military was like, no, it could be misused and Hamas could build tunnels with it. Well, you know, guess what? If a guy with a gun wants to build a tunnel, he's going to get the concrete from somewhere. And that concrete is not, however, a military material. It is not classified as a dual-use material. You need it to build schools. So for the ever since this closure regime was imposed on Gaza since 2007, that has led to a lack of schools as the population has increased of kids. And the schools that were in Gaza, they were teaching double shifts. Like some kids come in the morning, some kids come in the afternoon. You don't have enough schools, so you doubled the number of kids who go to each school, but you also reduced the quality of their education. Some schools were running triple shifts, okay? It's like a factory because that's what they were forced to do. After 2010, there was something called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which the UN got its hands dirty with. They were sort of agreeing with the Israelis to do this stuff, even though it was against all humanitarian principles. You can see why they did it, just to get something in. But like, we need a brand new paradigm for letting construction material into Gaza to build enough schools, and for letting people out. To go back to the question of hope and education, you know, a great source of hope for many Palestinians, I think, would be my uncle works in the Gulf. My aunt, you know, is a doctor in Turkey. There are huge success stories in many Palestinian families because education and that hard work actually paid off. People made huge sacrifices, but it paid off.
But then how are you going to leave?
And how are you going to leave? How's the next generation going to leave, you know?
Rasheed asked about hope. For me, the question could be also reverse. Now, I cannot imagine that after everything that happened in Gaza, some kids, young boys, have not been radicalized, seeking revenge, seeing their whole families being killed. Now, how to cope with this and how to fight that? We just had a really amazing episode with somebody from UK who's fighting radicalism as such. As a Muslim, he's fighting radicalism on both sides, far right but also in his communities. And he's doing it through media, so great project. But to my understanding, there are basically no NGOs, nobody who could do any like grassroots work like this in Gaza right now, right?
I mean, so going back to UNRWA, one of the things in UNRWA's curriculum that was really fascinating to me to learn about is that they had a human rights section of their curriculum.
Totally makes sense.
You know, there were lessons about the Holocaust being taught to Palestinian kids in UNRWA schools. Now, that's a long time ago. That's not current. But like that, if you think about, now I don't make this argument as a human rights advocate. I don't say children should be given their right to education, otherwise they'll become radicalized, right? It's their right to education. They're kids. It's not that they're going to become a security threat, therefore give it to them. Nonetheless, what you said is surely true. Like, you deny kids education, you blow up their homes, you kill their family members, and then you don't let them go to school or have hope. What do you think is going to happen? You know, is that going to be more radicalization or less?
Exactly.
I mean, give me a break. There's no security argument that could justify this. It all points the other direction. Yeah. What else? I think the messaging that kids are getting from the international community in Gaza right now is really the worst possible messaging. We have done nothing to stop what has happened to you, this collective punishment. We have actually armed the people doing it against you. And now we're going to not do anything to give you the right to go to school, the right to even hope for a better future. That last part has got to change.
You mentioned the curriculum. Do you think something may change right now after this conflict in how, for example, history is being taught to Gaza kids? Palestinian kids in general.
That's a good question. I mean, there's again the issue of Israeli control over the curriculum. I mean, even in Gaza,
they have a full control over the curriculum.
Well, if you want to get a textbook into Gaza, you have to get it through the Israeli authorities. And you know, again, let's go back 15 years. You know, there weren't just missing schools. There wasn't just 40,000 seats in classrooms missing. The kids who were in class, many of them didn't have textbooks, or they get a textbook for one class but not for the rest. They didn't have stationery to write on. They didn't have pens to write with because those things were held up at the border by the Israeli military. Ridiculous.
I mean, it's dangerous to bring pens and pencils.
Right. I don't know. They look like little rockets or something. So that is sort of insane. So what gets taught in Gaza schools, the Israeli occupation still has a lot of control over. I also kind of wonder, is the history of Palestine and Israel going to be taught differently in other classrooms around the world?
Oh, yeah. That's also a good question. Not
just in Gaza, but I mean, and how long is that going to take before kids in other countries get an accurate representation just of the facts about what happened? Because the issue of curriculum and the Israel-Palestine conflict is one of these political footballs. There's been a real investment in propaganda around the Palestinian curriculum, claiming that it teaches hatred of Jews or hatred of Israelis, which has been found to be pretty much nonsense, or at least no worse, and in some cases less bad than Israeli textbooks' dehumanization of Palestinians. You know, not a huge number of lessons. Like, there were no lessons in Palestinian textbooks saying, let's go kill the Jews or something. You know, nothing remotely like that. But it's been studied exhaustively because of claims that were made up out of thin air that Palestinians were teaching their kids to hate in schools. You know, that sort of distraction technique has been used to politicize education and change the focus from what's actually happening on the ground to these kids' real lives. So, you know, again, the issue of curriculum is been sucked into the politics, and you know, if we could choose, if we could hope and have our dreams come true, like education would just be kept aside from the politics. You know, the right to education, just let them have textbooks, let them have pens, let them have pieces of paper. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Absolutely.
But even the Palestinian kids who are in Israeli cities where Palestinians are Israeli also, when they go to school, a friend of mine from Israel, she told me that her boyfriend's father is a director of a school where they teach them all together. And he said, when they are in front of me, it's like the perfect future for Israel, Palestine. And then they go to their homes, and, you know, the parents, so the role of the parents. So, and they come, and he said, after the war, it was completely different, the school. A lot of hate between both. And he felt hopeless, and he was saying, I cannot do anything. And he said to his son to leave. He said, there is no hope with this, because these are the future and it's affecting them this way.
Those are probably the kids that have Israeli citizenship, right?
Yeah, I mean, 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian. They have that have nationality.
But history, you know, you cannot.
But they also, I mean, I think your friend's father was in a somewhat unusual position.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of teaching both Jewish Israeli and Palestinian citizens
Jewish
of Israel.
Israeli.
There aren't that many schools that do that.
Yeah. It's in Haifa. So, the city Haifa.
So in most cases, there's, I forget the term now, but there's like the there's the Arab stream or the Arab sector in education.
Oh.
They're not actually mingling all of these students together in many cases. It's quite unusual, and you'd have to be a real sort of progressive Jewish Israeli parent to send your kids to such a school where you deliberately want them to be mingling with Palestinian citizens of Israel. Like, that's not a usual norm social choice. You know, the system as it exists separates these kids. That's not a good thing. And of course, unsurprisingly, the resources that are given to, quote, Arab schools, far fewer than are given per student, per pupil to the Jewish schools.
In this, for me, like, when I see the future, personally, I don't trust that the war's not gonna start again. Maybe a year, another year. It happened before. So what would be maybe good for traumatized kids is learning, education stuff, math and stuff, but also learning survival skills, how to survive when there's bombing, hunger. I remember watching this documentary in Japan for kids. They teach them how to survive earthquakes because they have a lot of them. So they have trainings and they do scenarios and stuff. Do you think this is necessary?
Absolutely necessary. I mean, and there were programs that have been going on in Gaza for quite some time about trying to warn kids away from unexploded ordnance. We were talking about before, like the cluster submunitions are so attractive to little kids to pick up. So what to look out for, if you see something in a field, don't approach it, tell somebody else about it, that sort of thing. Like, that is crucial just to keep kids alive or not to have their legs blown off. But there's much more than that, But what can you teach a kid in Gaza to stay alive when medicine is being denied, when electricity was deliberately cut off, when water was cut off? I mean,
maybe just teach them something, because I heard this psychologist, his name is Jordan Peterson, he's talking about when you have a trauma, you need to learn how to defend yourself. So at least in your mind, you say, if it happens again, I'm not going to be a victim. So at least I will have the power. I will get hurt, but I will defend myself. So at least in the back of your mind, I have this skill, maybe.
Sort of
yeah, kind of prepared not to be, because he said it hurts more to think that you're going to be a victim again. So maybe just something to survive.
I met a child psychiatrist who was working with Palestinian kids who got evacuated from Gaza in Doha in Qatar. He's a really amazing guy. He's Sudanese. He was a little sad that more attention wasn't being paid to the kids in Sudan who were suffering through just horrific violence as well. But he was glad to be working with kids from Gaza. And he said it was completely surprising and unexpected to him that so few of them had clear signs of PTSD. So few of the Palestinian kids who made it out to Qatar, and these are kids who were, very lucky to get out, but also extremely unlucky because the only reason they got out was because they had really terrible injuries that were so clearly untreatable.
So it was not at the beginning right after the October 7th. It was
no, it was like it was later.
Okay.
It was later when
because I thought that they managed to somehow go at the very beginning when everything was.
A very few did because some would have relatives in Qatar they could go visit. But when the government program was set up to officially evacuate kids and others, it was a bit later. But anyway, they got there, and the psychiatrist was saying, I've never seen really anything like this, where you would expect kids to be really badly, clearly traumatized, visibly traumatized immediately from a situation like this. And his working theory was that there was a war in Gaza in 2008, 2009, massive bombardment, many homes destroyed. There was an airstrike campaign in 2012. There was massive bombardment and a ground invasion in 2014, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These kids they had that mental strength that you're talking about. They were prepared because, tragically, that was their life. Yeah. You're a young kid in Gaza, your life has been one war after another that you had nothing to do with, and your family had nothing to do with, but you're paying the price. And somehow they've built up a resilience to that, which is not to say that that's not incredibly painful. It's not to say that you're not going to suffer from that later in life. Like, of course you are. It's not that it's okay, but that resilience, that strength really even shocked a seasoned war child psychiatrist.
Wow.
It's really sad that this became a new normal. Right, that like as a child you think like, okay, it happened, it will happen, it will happen again, and okay, I'm sort of prepared for it, I'm mentally prepared for it, that this is child's mind right now somewhere in the world, that this is gonna be my new normal from time to time.
You mentioned before that there are so many kids that lost one parent or two, and they have to step up to become the parents to take responsibility for the kids, to bring food, to bring everything, and they had to go outside actually many times because they were small, they run faster. So how now those kids, because you cannot just tell them go to school because now they have a family to support. What is the solution to bring them back to education and being a kid again and not a parent when you are just 8?
Yeah, so for one thing, child labor rates are through the roof. Again, just to take a step back, 2007, when this closure starts getting imposed, unemployment rates and poverty rates in Gaza were bad, but not horrific. But it got worse every year. And then, now it's virtually everybody's in poverty. Almost everybody's been displaced. Most people have had their homes blown up. And the kids have gone out to find what kind of work they could, anything to earn just a little bit of money. Also because there's nothing else to do. There's no school to go to. If we were to return to a state of normality where school was an option, how would you get kids to go to school? Exactly what you're saying. Well, you have to make it worth their while, and you have to address, first of all, their number one concern, which is who else is going to provide for their family. Yeah. So if you don't flood Gaza with aid, if you don't get enough support in there to remove the burden on those kids, well, of course, they love their family. They're going to sacrifice their own education so that they can go out to work. So remove that driver of child labor and provide supply and demand, and give them the schools to go to.
I'm interested about orphanages because I can assume there is probably or was already before this crackdown on Gaza big number of orphans from the previous conflicts. Who's taking care of that? Is it UNRWA? Was it Hamas? Was it more of a neighbors' help?
There were a whole bunch of organizations that were helping kids who'd lost one or both parents, but really the biggest providers are the extended family. I haven't done a sort of careful survey of this, and there are a bunch of organizations doing great work, but my impression was that many of those kids would then be taken into the extended family and cared for that way. So what you need is not like and by the way, institutional orphanages are bad for kids. I mean, we just know developmentally that's not a good thing. Deinstitutionalization is what we want. We don't want to see orphanages constructed. That means there's experience in other parts of the world in getting funding and support, psychosocial experts, giving advice and stuff, therapy in that family setting. That's where the aid and the resources need to go. Make sure it gets to the families who are taking care of those kids who've lost their parents. Don't send it to some big orphanage institution.
Okay. Is there a distinct war effect between boys and girls in Gaza in their ability to go back to school? This question is because I read a report by the UN 2024. They say over 690,000 menstruating women and adolescent girls in Gaza are facing severe lack of supplies for menstrual hygiene and water. And this leads to poor menstrual health and access to hygiene facilities serve as a barrier for girls' education and well-being during conflicts.
Everywhere, basically.
Everywhere, yeah. I mean, you wouldn't think that access to clean toilets and to hygiene kits would be such a crucial thing for education. But you should think that because the data proves it. Girls will be forced to miss out or even if there is a bathroom facility, but it's like a long way away, or it's kind of hidden and it's not so comfortable to go there, or it exists but it's very dirty and nasty. Like you're just asking for a disease if you go. So that's a huge disincentive for girls. So yes, they have girls and young women who their right to education requires that be addressed, that they be able to go to school in a safe way and take care of themselves, and they have hygiene kits provided so that they're not stigmatized for something so normal.
And we're talking about potentially putting tents to start education as fast as possible, right? This will be so difficult to do.
Yeah.
Imagine. Bill, there is a big discussion about whether what happened in Gaza is a genocide or not. People are raising this argument that in order for it to be a genocide, it has to be either religious, racist, racial, or national level. It cannot be a political level, and they're claiming that this is a political matter. What is your take on that?
Well, there's pretty clear I mean, the law is fairly clear on what genocide is, and it requires, of course, it's a crime, so you have to commit an act, and you have to commit that act with the intention that's required by this the law. Genocide is a very unique crime because you have to kill large numbers of people or do things that are likely to lead to the deaths of large numbers of people. You could slow death is a form of genocide, cutting off people's water, you know, and trapping them in an area, you know, deliberately, you know, that you know it's going to lead to large numbers of death. That is a genocidal act. But then the question is, did you commit it with the specific intent to kill these people, not just to kill them, but to kill them because they're members of a group as such? You want to kill them, not just to kill them, but for that reason. So the difference, for example, would be we found very clearly, no question, that cutting off the water access in Gaza by the Israeli authorities and blowing up water infrastructure inside Gaza and killing water repair workers inside Gaza, blowing up their warehouses with spare parts and blocking the import of spare parts and repair stuff and water infrastructure. All of that, and not letting anybody leave, that's the crime against humanity of extermination. You know it's going to kill a lot of people and you do it deliberately. But is that enough to call it genocide? You know, it's a tricky question. Now, Amnesty International came out with a report that looked at all of the Israeli military's actions, from airstrikes to the siege, you know, to all. They really took a holistic picture, and they said yes, this is enough to conclude genocide. And we're seeing more and more of that. I mean, there's a genocide case going on by South Africa at the International Court of Justice, and that the court has told Israel 3 times, open all of the border crossings, allow in all of the aid that is needed. And during the war, Israel completely flouted not 1, not 2, but 3 of those orders. So the case for genocidal intent grows stronger, you know, by every time you look at it.
In the end, you worked on a report on hospitals recently. I assume it's not public yet, but can you share some findings on that?
Well, I can say what we're looking for or what we're looking at. You know, there was a lot of the Israeli attacks on hospitals were very controversial, but as usual, it sort of devolved in media reporting to kind of, well, the Israelis said this and Hamas said this, so who knows? You know, the Israelis said Hamas was using hospitals for military purposes, which means that under the law, the hospital is no longer a protected civilian object. It can be attacked. And it's true. If you use a hospital for acts that are harmful to the enemy, then the hospital can be attacked. But there's another question, which wasn't being asked, which is, in many of these cases, Israeli ground troops went right into the hospital, and they were in total control of that facility for days or weeks, and there was no fighting going on. And in some cases, they went into the hospital again after having previously gone in and blown up a tunnel that was underneath it. The main hospital in Gaza, Al-Shifa, there was a tunnel underneath part of it, and the Israeli forces blew that up last year, and then they went in again. When you are in complete control of anywhere, but in particularly a hospital, what happens then? You know, you can't really say, oh, well, Hamas made me do it. If patients are dying from lack of medication, if somebody should be evacuated in an ambulance, but the ambulance is denied getting to them, or the ambulance is blown up by a missile. That's the sort of issue that we've heard a lot of stories about that raises, it's a kind of clear-cut case. So we're looking at, okay, well, what happened during that specific time period of total uncontested Israeli forces, ground forces control of hospitals?
I'm going to, at the end, shift the topic a little bit. Since you've worked in education in many different countries, do you have any good examples of how the education could really work for refugee kids? Because it is a difficult topic anywhere to suddenly host a new group of students from a different country, prepare the whole educational system for them. So this education in those new countries are facing many challenges. Any good examples, good practices?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should quickly say I am not in any way advocating that Palestinian kids should become refugees again in some other country, because there's a lot of concern that just as moving from the West Bank to Gaza was a one-way ticket, moving from Gaza to Egypt could be a one-way ticket.
And Trump is talking to moving them to Albania. He had this suggestion. Oh my God.
Yes. I mean, or wherever. They don't, it's first of all, they have the right to return to their own homes and their family homes from before 1948. Like I'm not making that up. That's international law. That's their right. So anyway, I'm veering from the topic, but if we talk about other kids, so Palestinian kids are in an emergency, a crisis, a war zone, a post-war moment right now that has a lot of similarities to refugee contexts. But we don't want these kids to be forced to move elsewhere. But in other contexts, there's a lot of stuff that can make refugee education work. The kids are different from the local kids. They might speak a different language. Well, you allow them to do language training without making it into something that's going to cause them to fail out of school because they can't learn the language before they're forced to, for example, learn ancient Greek. And then, take an exam in ancient Greek just like a Greek student would have to do very quickly. Like that, you're really setting somebody up to fail. That, like, so hard, right? Why don't we make Greek kids take lessons in ancient, Afghan history or something, in Dari? Give me a break. So don't impose. It's really just reasonableness. What are you going to require of them? What kind of streaming into the education system are you going to do? But it breaks down into all these different little moments where there could be a barrier if you're stupid about it, or if you're reasonable about wanting to get these kids education, you can get them an education. What's the best way to figure out what those barriers are and how to overcome them? It's to ask the refugee community. There is a standard in international law that says any education response for refugees, the refugee community has to be in the driver's seat. Planning it, implementing it, monitoring it, running it, they need to be right there from the start. Because if you come in as the white savior and be like, here's what's good for refugee kids, it's going to crash and burn.
Absolutely. Bill, such an important topic. Thank you very much for coming and discussing it with us today. I feel like it needs to be discussed more in details rather than constantly talking about those political views from this or that side, because it is about real lives of people happening right now on the ground. Thank you very much for being with us in this episode of Fracture. Thank you very much to Allianz Foundation, Choose Love, and Leave No One Behind. Thank you very much to Aperture for supporting this podcast. The next interview is going to be on air in 2 weeks' time, but in 1 week you will be able to enjoy the Humanitarian Watch. So stay tuned.
In my country, being a woman itself is a crime.
In my country, it is illegal for a woman's voice to be heard in the street.
In my country, my creative freedom can cost me my blood.
I have a refugee protection, but I'm invisible.
I have a refugee protection, but freedom is not free. You have to buy it.
I don't even have a country. Try being an activist when you're stateless.
I have refugee status, but without NGOs like Refocus, I wouldn't have any support.
I am a recognized refugee in Europe, but I'm still being stopped at airports for holding a refugee travel document.
In Refocus, I can be myself, an artist, in a safe place.
In Refocus, I can be brave in my art and reconnect with activism.
In Refocus, I can create media and teach others.
I stayed here because of Refocus. I bet on Refocus because there is no creative borders here.
Our community wants to say thank you to everyone who has been so generous with their support. But we still need your help to ensure our community continues. You can help change someone's life just like ours by donating today.